Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Imagine Nonfiction reading. My name is Kristine Chan, and I'm currently an MFA student in Stony Brook University's Creative Writing and Literature program. Today, we have two very exciting speakers who would also happen to be Stony Brook faculty teaching in our BFA and MFA programs here. So let's get started. First up, we'll hear from Kaylie Jones, who is a novelist and memoirist. Her memoir, Lies My Mother Never Told Me, was published in 2009 by HarperCollins. Her third novel, A Soldier's Daughter Never Cries, was adapted as a Merchant Ivory film in 1998. Her novel, The Anger Meridian, was published by Akashic Books in June 2015. Her recent essays have been published in The Rumpus, Hippocampus Magazine, and the Southampton Review. Her latest short fiction, The Book of Amal, appeared in the anthology The Night Bazaar, Venice, edited by Lenore Hart. Her essay Fork in the Road is included in One Last Lunch, an anthology edited by Erica Heller. She has been teaching in the Stony Brook Southampton College MFA program since its inception. So I'll hand it over to you, Kaylie.
Hi, everybody. I thought I would read a memoir piece that was published in the Southampton Review a couple of years ago. I am still working on a series of short essays on motherhood. This one's called One True Friend, and it's for my friend Lee. My 10-year-old daughter stepped off the school bus with tears streaming down her face and her entire body shaking. I dropped to my knees on the pavement and wrapped my arms around her as she stood there sobbing. I had never seen her quite so upset, so I just held her, no idea what to do, asking her over and over what was wrong. Finally, she stepped back and started dragging herself up the avenue. At the corner, I reached for her hand and she did not pull away. I got the story in fits and starts as we walked several city blocks towards home. At lunchtime in the cafeteria, she had gotten her tray and headed for her gang of friends sitting at their usual table. As she set down her lunch, her best friend, Karen, said, "You can't sit here anymore." Karen stared with disgust at my daughter's tray. She told me now, shamefacedly, that she'd taken 2 sandwiches and 2 desserts because she was hungry. Karen said, "You're a pig. You eat too much, and you can't sit here anymore." My girl had stood frozen, her eyes going from face to face around the table of 6 girls, all of them friends of hers who had come to birthday parties and sleepovers at our house. Not one of them spoke up. Karen was known to have a cruel temper, and they were probably afraid of her. I had the good sense not to say what I always said to my daughter when issues about her eating came up, which was that she was not fat and it was okay to eat whatever she wanted to eat, which is what the therapist had told me to say. In truth, I worried constantly about her eating, not because she was overweight for her age, but because I knew that her overeating was an indication that something was making her unhappy. And my fear was that she felt the same vast, empty black hole in the center of her being that had plagued me all my life. Instead, I said in as calm and equable a tone as I could muster, "Well, what did you do then, my darling? What did you say?" Finally, after my girl had stood there in the dead silence of the table, surrounded by the echoing, crashing noise of the cafeteria, she had picked up her tray, walked back toward the empty tray racks, dumped her lunch into the big black trash can, slid the tray into a slot, and went and locked herself in a bathroom stall. She stood with her face pressed against the locked door and waited for the end of lunch bell to ring. In 5th grade, they weren't allowed to leave school during lunch period. There was nowhere else for her to go. I wanted to run home and call the principal, take a cab over to Karen's house and press the buzzer till her mom let me in so I could tell the little bully what I thought of her. But in truth, I didn't know what to do, for there really was nothing I could do. I asked my daughter if she wanted an ice cream cone, which usually made everything better, but she shook her head and kept on sobbing. I took a deep breath and started telling her a story I had never told anyone before. The shame of it plagued me still. When I was 11, I told her, in my school in Paris, one of my friends turned the whole 7th grade against me. My girl caught her breath and stopped sobbing long enough to glance up at me with her big, wet, hazel eyes. "What did you do?" I wasn't sure if she meant what did I do to deserve that or what did I do after I found myself ostracized. I did not know how to tell the story, which still made my stomach roil and my mouth go dry. I said, this girl, her name was Cornelia. She invited me to a party she was going to on a Saturday afternoon. The parents of this French boy weren't home. We used to have these parties where we'd close the curtains and put a blue light bulb in one of the lamps. Back then we had record players and we piled up the 45s on the turntable. That's what we called those small records that only play one song. And then we sat in a circle and played Spin the Bottle. You did not, said my daughter, who had stopped sobbing, though her breaths continued to come in great ragged shudders that tore at my heart. This felt to me like a victory, so I plowed on. I squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and we kept walking. It was a small party, I told her, and I didn't know these kids well. I'd just been moved into the dummy class that fall, while most of my friends, including my best friend Lee, were still in the normal class. I was also a year younger than almost everyone else. I'd started first grade at 5. I never really knew why my parents had done this, and when I asked my mother, she'd say without much interest, they told us you were ready. Maybe I was ready intellectually to be a year ahead, but emotionally I was not. I thought it was because my parents just wanted to get me out of the house. The dummy class? My daughter cried out. Really, Mom, that is so not okay. We weren't so PC back then, I told her. My best friend Lee was not invited to this particular party, I told my daughter, and I felt nervous in this unfamiliar crowd. And by the time Lee called me on Sunday afternoon to get my side of the story, Cornelia had telephoned everyone except the nerds who were already ostracized to tell them that I'd let 3 different boys at the party go all the way with me. All the way, I said to my daughter. I was only 11 years old. I didn't even know what all the way meant. Why would Cornelia say such a thing? And on that Sunday afternoon, as I listened to my best friend Lee on the phone, my heart crashing around inside my ribcage, I tried to think back, to remember every detail of the party. Maybe I had spun the bottle a little too enthusiastically or gone off under the dining room table to make out with 3 boys instead of the customary 2. It didn't seem to me that I'd done anything outrageous. Lee told me the girls, that girls she barely knew had been calling her, each one embellishing the monstrous details, and here was the strangest thing. Even the girls who'd been at the party, who were there the entire time and knew it wasn't true, were adding their 2 cents to the expanding lie. I had apparently taken off my clothes under the dining room table and let anyone who wanted to come over and do things to me. I felt the need to defend myself to Lee on the phone, my best friend, to protest my innocence. And I felt myself getting angry at her for bringing me this news. What could I have possibly done to Cornelia to have her turn on me like this? I was stunned at the magnitude and the speed with which these rumors had spread. The most painful part was the realization that I was so profoundly disliked. And Cornelia, she had slept over countless times at my house, and I'd slept over at hers twice. Monday morning, I arrived at school with my stomach twisted in knots. Alors, t'es une petite pute, said Bertrand, a boy with a runny nose whose white shirt tails were always sticking out of his blue uniform sweater. So you're a little whore, is what he said. His eyes roved over me the way he might have gazed at bugs burning in a jar. And you're ugly and you're disgusting, I replied and walked away on unsteady legs. Cornelia was absent that morning, for which I was grateful. Cornelia's mom was divorced and worked, so Cornelia often skipped morning classes with no consequences. But it was only October, and all I could think about was that I would never be able to survive an entire school year like this. At least in the classroom with Cornelia absent, I felt fairly safe, though I could hear kids whispering behind me. But lunch break inevitably came, and I put on my blue uniform peacoat to go outside. I decided I would escape, take the metro home, and tell my parents that I needed to change schools. Maybe I could go to the American school in St. Cloud. I was desperate to find Lee in the crowded hallway, but I did not see her long, rain-straight, pale blonde hair in the throng of shaggy brown heads and blue sweaters and jackets. She was my one true friend and had been since we were 7, since the day she'd arrived at school from New York City, not speaking a word of French. I was her translator for her first 3 months. By then, she was much more popular than I and no longer needed my help. We'd remained best friends, But the horrible thought now crossed my mind that maybe even Lee would shun me. I headed outside to wait for her, not feeling anonymous, even in the herd of blue uniforms stampeding down the stairs, through the main hall, and out into the street. Outside the front doors, kids were standing around in groups, and as I moved away from the building, I suddenly realized I was passing through a gauntlet. At the end of this gauntlet stood Cornelia, surrounded by her minions, boys and girls who had been at the party, and she looked positively outraged as she stared at me, as if she actually believed the lies she'd spread. I felt sick. My intestines twisted themselves into knots and my knees were about to crumble. I was filled with shame. It was as if just by saying the things she'd said, she'd made them true. "You're such a whore," she stated in a self-righteous, triumphant voice. Her friends stood around her with their arms crossed, staring at me. If she'd been alone, I might have taken her on. Probably no chance I'd ever win. She was shorter and stockier than I, and stronger, but I might have tried. But I was alone, and she was surrounded, protected, and safe. Someone suddenly stepped in beside me. In my peripheral vision, I saw the long, shining blonde hair. "Vous êtes des cons," said Lee in a clear, confident voice. "You're a real bunch of assholes." And the two of us stood there, shoulder to shoulder, she just slightly in front of me, waiting for them to make a move. We all remained perfectly still for a long time. I could hear my heart pounding in my head. Finally, one of the French boys, bored, broke ranks and walked away. Lee muttered, "Let's go get lunch." And she pushed her way past Cornelia, nudging her to the side. No one tried to stop us, and no one said a word. Nothing was resolved, I now told my daughter. I had a terrible time of it over the next several months. That was the worst school year of my life. Every weekend there was a party, and Lee sometimes went, but I was not invited. That was mostly okay. She and I still had sleepovers. My best friend had not abandoned me in my time of need. "Those girls at the table," I told my daughter, "they're not worth your time. One true friend is worth 50 cowards. What happened to Lee?" my daughter wanted to know. Her strained and tear-streaked face was somewhat calmer now, and her eyes were shining again, bright with curiosity. "Oh, she got married to a very nice man. She lives in San Diego." "Can we go see her?" she asked. Lee and I had not seen each other in many years, but I still had her phone number. About 15 years earlier, she had called me to make her 9th step amends. She'd been in a rehab in Minnesota, then a halfway house for 6 months, and then about to drive across the country to the warmer climes of San Diego. She called to ask my forgiveness for borrowing a few dollars, for falling down drunk a couple of times in a bar when we were young. I said to her, you don't ever have to make amends to me for anything. You stood by my side when everyone else didn't. You'll always be my best friend, and you owe me nothing. And I love you exactly as you are." There was a long silence, and then Lee said, "I wish I could believe that I was that strong, but I never felt strong. I was always afraid. You must have brought out the best in me." I told my girl I would call Lee when we got home and ask her if we could come visit. Her son was only a year older than my daughter. "Maybe we can go for your spring break," I suggested. When Lee picked up the phone, I said, "Hello, old friend." And she said my name with such joy that my heart felt suddenly warm. She had always been a safe haven where I didn't need to pretend to be anyone but myself. I told her about my daughter's troubles at school and how it had reminded me of back when we were in 7th grade. I could barely get the words out, so choked up was I, despite the ocean of time that lay between us. Lee invited us to come visit, and we decided to take our children to swim with the dolphins at SeaWorld during spring break, something wonderful for my girl to look forward to while she suffered through her days. "Speaking of Cornelia," Lee finally said, her voice suddenly tight, "I have some news." Lee had kept in touch with the Alumni Association of our Paris school. She told me that someone had sent her an article from a Florida newspaper. Cornelia had become a heroin addict and died a terrible death. Lee asked for my email address and forwarded the article to me. There was a very nice picture of Cornelia during happier times, her pale, freckled face in the bloom of youth, a straw fedora with a dark ribbon cocked at a jaunty angle over her dark corkscrew curls. She had not been a pretty child, but in the photo she was pretty and bursting with life. The article read, "A homeless woman lying in a parking spot was killed Tuesday night by a driver who says she didn't realize the bump she felt as she pulled her car in was a person. Cornelia Savage was either sleeping or passed out in the parking lot of a St. Petersburg, Florida condo complex when the woman pulled into her assigned parking spot. A passerby police Wednesday morning after noticing Savage's hand sticking out from underneath the parked car. She was pronounced dead at 8:12 a.m. She was always the most popular and beloved of all the siblings, her brother George Savage told the Tampa Bay Times. She was the one who got the attention, who got the love, who lit up a room. She was a young lady who had every possible advantage. And then something happened, he told the paper, and I don't even know what. Cornelia's brother and sister were so much older, we'd never even met them. They were already grown up, and their father had remarried and lived in Florida with a brand new family. Cornelia had spent her childhood mostly alone in a converted greenhouse, up a flight of stairs and across door terrace from her mother's apartment. We all thought this was just great to have so much freedom. But now, when I think about it, to be out there at night or during a thunderstorm, surrounded by all that glass, she must have been quite frightened and alone. I could have told the grown-ups what had happened, but no one ever asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaylie, for that wonderful reading. And it was such an insightful view on what it's like just growing up and that whole experience that we go through. So we're actually going to wait till later for all of our questions and comments. But in the meantime, it looks like everyone's enjoying this event. So I'm going to hold on to a couple questions and save them for later. But for now, let's get to one more reading. Our next reader today is going to be Robert Lopez, who is the author of 3 novels, Part of the World, Camby Belongo Mean River, named one of 25 important books of the decade by HTML Giant, All Back Full, and 2 story collections, Asunder and Good People. A new book, A Better Class of People, will be published by Zank Books in 2022. So I'll hand it over to you, Robert.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here reading with Kaylie and hanging out with all of you today. I'm going to read 2 short bits. One is a whole brief essay, and one is the beginning of a longer essay. This one's called Return to Breakfast. I have a friend who every time she sees me asks if I've lost weight, and the answer is maybe one day, or wouldn't that be nice, or I don't see it happening. I can tell her I don't own a scale, so I can't say one way or the other. I never say this out loud to my friend because why bother? I never tell her I have other friends who, if I haven't seen them in a while, tell me I look good, which might mean the same thing. It never occurs to me to say that to someone, that they look good, but I always wish it did. I think I told my friend that when I meet students for the first time in a class setting, I go around the room and ask what they had for breakfast. Someone might say oatmeal, and I'll ask if it was steel cut or instant or whatever. Then I'll ask what they put in the oatmeal, and if the answer doesn't include fruit or berries and maple syrup or honey and either almond, walnut, or pecan, then I will admonish them. Once someone said they had a tuna sandwich and there was a bell pepper in it, and I asked them to leave the room. Almost always someone asks what I've had for breakfast, and I tell them yogurt with granola and blueberries, whether it's true or not. My friend doesn't know that breakfast was always my favorite growing up, and there was nothing better than breakfast for dinner. Years later, I ordered pancakes at a diner, and my girlfriend at the time said I should order an adult's breakfast. She was having some sort of frittata or eggs Benedict, and apparently this was more adult-like. This was someone who once, no lie, stomped her feet during an argument and stormed off into another room. I didn't know this particular friend back then, and so she doesn't know this about me. that I was in this kind of relationship, that pancakes are somehow juvenile, according to at least one person on the planet. For years, I skipped breakfast and would eat what I'd term a lunch, usually a sandwich, sometime after noon. This is when I was my trimmest as an adult, but I didn't play tennis back then. I forgot to mention that this friend is someone I play tennis with, so maybe that somehow makes a difference. Before tennis, I eat oatmeal or some kind of oat cereal with either soy or almond milk, or the aforementioned yogurt with granola and fruit, and it's enjoyable, but never satisfying. Ever since I started playing tennis at 40, my appetite has spiked and I've put on some extra weight. People would describe me as solid or stocky. I'm thick, muscular, except for the gut, which protrudes like a typical middle-aged American. Some of my tennis shirts might be larger than others, so this could be the reason my friend thinks I've lost weight. The next time I see my friend after a long interim, I'm going to tell her she looks good, whether it's true or not. I'm going to tell her that the fundamental problem with breakfast is simple. As soon as it's finished, there's a decision to make about lunch and what to do about it. So even though there's currently a tropical storm blowing through the streets of Brooklyn, replete with a teeming downpour and howling winds, there's probably an intrepid delivery man who will starve if no one orders Thai food today. I can't let this happen, not because I want the pad see ew with chicken or shrimp dumplings, but because I am a humanitarian and care about other people. Which brings me back to my friend and how I've never, not once, asked if she's lost weight. Because is that an appropriate question to ask someone you haven't seen in months? Okay, so there's that one. And we're gonna finish up with the beginning of an essay called Coming from Nowhere, which is the first piece in a collection of essays that I am finishing up now called Dispatches from Puerto Nowhere. The first time someone called me a spick was during recess or after school in the playground or in the park across the street from my house. I was in shirt sleeves and it was hot, or I had on a heavy winter coat with a ski hat and gloves and boots because it had snowed overnight and we could see our breath in the frigid winter cold. I like the thought of the word spick hanging frozen in the air, the vapors of which are exhaled and linger for an unnatural period of time, like in a Sunday morning cartoon until they disappear. That's how I've experienced most of what's happened to me from childhood on, as a series of vapors, exhalations, and disappearances. Back when children wore snowsuits in such weather, the ones that had the mittens tied into the sleeves, the winters were majestic all over New York. There were blizzards every other weekend, and the drifts would bury the cars parked in the streets and the trees lining the sidewalks. It seemed as if we would never see the cars again, and if school ever did reopen, we'd have to use wooden tennis rackets as makeshift snowshoes to get there. We took photographs. And when I say we, I mean my mother and father took photographs of the cars, of my sister and me, all buried and content and whited out on our lawn outside of our Levitt house in the middle of a particularly conservative and culturally bankrupt part of the country known as Long Island. One wouldn't think of this as a realistic setting where one person calls another a spick for the first time. One imagines a brilliant sun and blaring heat, people sweating and wearing mirrored sunglasses and sandals instead of ski hats and waterproof boots. My sister and I would go out to the backyard and build snow forts. We did this in matching snowsuits designed to keep us safe and dry and warm, which were bulky and ridiculous and didn't allow for any sort of athletic maneuver. You couldn't fight in them, for instance, but you could build a fort, and after the fort was built, you could build another fort right next to it. I have no memory of what, if anything, we did inside the forts. The first time someone called me a spick, I was 6 or 9 or 11 years old. The last time someone called me a spick was probably in high school, and most likely a term of endearment. I don't think my sister was ever called a spick, regardless of the weather. I'm sure she was called other things, but none of them ethnically motivated. I remember her friends used to call her Coco for Coco Lopez, which is a Puerto Rican coconut product used in many popular drinks. I don't think girls were called spicks in the 1980s. Maybe they never were. Now, when it snows, I stay inside. Maybe I look out the window, but I wait for the city to plow the streets and for the superintendents to shovel the sidewalks before I venture out into the world, unless it is absolutely necessary, unless I have no choice, and it's about food or the possibility of tennis. I never play in the snow, stopped all that around the age of 8. I hear stories of grown people sledding in the park or cross-country skiing after a blizzard, building snow structures and the like. I remember once a woman I dated expressed consternation when I didn't throw a snowball at her after she pelted me with one while we were out walking one winter's day. She accused me of having no fun. Now, I like it best when I go on the school website and they say that all classes are canceled. I don't do anything special or especially productive with this unexpected day off. And it isn't as if I don't like my job, but it still feels like a get out of jail free card. I'll stay inside for days until order is restored, until it stops snowing and the wind isn't a constant assault. I do the same thing during a heat wave, unless it is absolutely necessary that I play tennis, which it often is, but only sometimes during the heat of the day. Most often, I try to play after the sun begins to hide behind the trees and I can play in shadows. All of this amounts to staying safe, cocooned and comfortable, and away from the outside world and all the dangers therein and thereupon. The world is none of my business sometimes. Inside, I have countless books and cable television and a vast library of music, 2 air conditioners and 2 guitars, and there are even people to bring me food whenever I'm hungry. All I have to do is sign on and order up, tip the Mexican or Guatemalan man $2 or $3. Inside a snow fort on Long Island, inside an apartment building in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn, we remain safe. We remain safe from efforts starting 80 years ago in other parts of Brooklyn and parts of the Bronx, when my parents' parents were desperate to have their children accepted as Americans, speaking only English at home and everywhere else, no discernible trace of an accent. Okay, I'll stop there. It goes on and on for a lot of pages after that, and it's going to change your life if you read it.
All right, thank you, Robert, for such a beautiful reading. I especially enjoyed the detail of a snow day as a get out of jail free card, because that is certainly what it feels like to all of us too.
Yeah.
So let's see. It looks like everyone's been enjoying this so much. Terrific. I remember a couple people were saying LOL and ha, and just generally laughing and enjoying the detail of the tennis shirts. Someone said, so great. Nice, Kaylie. Very cool. Powerful. There's plenty of applause in the chat as well. So now that we've heard from both of our speakers today, does anyone in the audience have any questions for our speakers? And while you guys have a little time to enter your questions for everyone, I'm going to take advantage of this brief break and say that since we have both BFA and MFA students here today, maybe either of you have some advice for students who are maybe just starting to experiment with finding their own voice and style in their own writing. So how did that process go for either of you?
Kaylie, would you like to start and I'll finish?
Sure. Well, I was really Am I muted? I'm okay. I was really not good at anything except writing and some acting in college. And so when it came time to figure out what to do with my future, I decided to I called one MFA program, Columbia, and I asked them if I had to take any GREs or LSATs or anything to get, any kind of test to get in. They said, no, you just have to submit work. And I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to do. So I submitted, and I ended up going to Columbia for grad school for 2 years. And, pretty much because I didn't know what else to do with myself. And I ended up learning more there than probably ever before in my life. And I didn't know very much about writing. I thought I had a pretty good sense of storytelling, but technique and point of view and all the things that, that plague us as writers, I just didn't know. And, that's where I began my novel. And I think the most important thing that I can tell students is to listen to not just your instructors when they give you advice, but to the students whose work you admire and whose whose opinions on fiction or memoir you agree with. And I think that really helps, to focus your work and to not take criticism personally. That was the hardest thing for me at Columbia. Was I felt that there was a lot of judgment passed and people would say nasty things about not so much the quality of the work, but the content. So I think that's dangerous and it can be very harmful to writers. And so I try to avoid doing that as a teacher and to just focus on craft and not on any judgments of the writer, because I think that really is not the right way to go.
For my part, I came of age as a writer. I first started writing in the very early 90s. And back then, Raymond Carver had quite an influence on a lot of short story writers in particular. And so for me, everything that I did was an imitation of him and other quote unquote minimalists or Kmart realists of the time. And I would write stories titled Not Far From Here and all kinds of ripoffs like that. But then eventually, the more I read, the more I got fed other ways of telling stories and other uses of form. And eventually, through imitation and then finally finding my own voice over time, it kind of happened quickly once it did happen. And I figured out what it was I was supposed to do as a writer, what I could do best. And so for me, I always advocate reading as a way to feed what it is you want to become as a writer. And the old maxim, amateurs imitate and professionals steal. I think you have to cut your teeth and imitate for a while and then steal outright from the writers that you enjoy the most and find who it is you are supposed to be on the page.
All right, thank you, Robert, and thank you, Kaylie, for answering my question. So it looks like we've got ongoing applause in the chat, but since we don't have any more questions, I'm gonna be a little selfish and ask my own again. So for both of you, what is your process for deciding when a piece is quote unquote finished? I know a lot of us say that our work is never really finished.
I was just discussing this in my undergrad class yesterday, that we were discussing revisions, and I said exactly what you just said. It may seem, you may seem at a certain point to have finished something, but you can come back years later and look at it and still be making edits, still be making changes. Even what I read today, which was published, a couple of years ago in the Southampton Review, I was marking up, changing a word here and there. And this is years, a couple of years later. And I thought it was done at the time, and it's pretty much done, but it's an ongoing process. And I think usually I depend on my editors to tell me when it's done, because I'll just keep going. It's hard for me to stop revising at a certain point, like a control freak, letting it go. Once you let it go, then it's out of your hands, and then you really have no control over it. And I find that a difficult part of the process.
Yeah, I obviously revision is hugely important, and you always have to revise everything you do. For me though, when I know something is finished, it's kind of a useless thing to say out loud, and particularly for students. But it's just an intuitive feeling that I have. I say, "Ooh, I think this is done. I think there's nothing more to add or subtract," and as a result, it feels finished. Now, of course, going back and looking at it years later, which probably is a mistake, you always want to cut out a word here or there and do that sort of thing. And then if you're reading it for performance, if you're reading it out loud for people, I find that I might take out stuff that just doesn't feel like it works as well in the air as it does on the page. But I am not, I'm not someone, if something's been published, then I'm pretty good at forgetting about it and leaving it be. I know other writers don't, and I've seen what Kaylie just mentioned. I had a buddy named Michael Kimball, who's a terrific writer, and he visited my class once at the New School, and he's reading from a copy of one of his books. And I'm looking over his shoulder, and I see their entire sentences and paragraphs crossed out in the hard copy of the book. So the process doesn't really end, but at some point you do just have to wait, raise the white flag and move on to the next thing.
Thank you both for that nerve-wracking and reassuring advice, and from your own experience too. So that was definitely interesting for all of us to hear today. And let's see, it looks like we have no further questions, but it does look like everyone really enjoyed the reading. So in that case, Kaylie, Robert, thank you both so much for sharing your work with all of us here today. And also, Frank, thank you for handling all the behind the scenes aspects of this. And Molly, thank you for inviting me to MC today's nonfiction reading. Have a good day, everyone.